Swami Medhananda ji is a well-known figure in this academic circle. He doesn't need any introduction, but officially I need to introduce him with our audience. Swami Medhananda ji is a monk of the Ramakrishna Order, initiated by revered Swami Swahananda ji, who happened to be the direct disciple of Srimad Swami Vijnana ji, one of the monastic disciples of Sri Ramakrishna. And he received sannyasa from Srimad Swami Smaranananda ji Maharaj. He currently serves as Senior Research Fellow in Philosophy at Vedanta Society, Southern California, and as a Hindu Chaplain at UCLA and the University of Southern California. He is the author of several influential books, including Karma and Rebirth in Hinduism, Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, the book of today's discussion. He's also edited major volumes on Vedanta and comparative philosophy and published extensively in leading journals such as Philosophy East and West, Journal of Indian Philosophy, Religious Studies, and The Monist. Swami Medhananda ji received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and has delivered lectures at institutions including Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Oxford. His current research focuses on Vedanta, Sri Ramakrishna, Sri Aurobindo, and cross-cultural philosophy. Without making any further delay, I'd request Swami Medhananda ji to deliver his talk. Over to you, Swami Medhananda ji.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this program. And I look forward to a conversation, actually. I've given a lot of talks on this book already. They're all available on YouTube. The book itself can be read, and I hope some of you have. I'd like to have more of an interactive discussion if possible. And just as a kind of prelude to that, I'll say a few words to contextualize the book a little bit.
Yeah.
So maybe I can begin by discussing briefly my own personal journey in a way, or part of my spiritual journey that led me to writing this book in the first place. When I was a young man in the US, I was born and raised in Boston, and I was doing my PhD at Berkeley. My specialization was German philosophy. And for most of my young adult life, I was an agnostic, very skeptical, very critical, but deeply interested in religion at the same time. And so as an agnostic, I was studying different religious traditions. So Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, and so on. And my first entry point into Hinduism was the Bhagavad Gita. And I found that very inspiring. But I kind of ignored all the bhakti in it, the devotional aspects, because I was agnostic. So I was agnostic. Then what happened was I discovered Shankara. Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. And I was introduced by him, I think initially, I don't remember exactly, but probably through the complete works of Swami Vivekananda. I read the 9 volumes of Swami Vivekananda's works during my PhD. And at the same time was starting to study Shankara's philosophy, and I found it extremely appealing. Probably because of my mindset at the time. Because I was agnostic, I really credit Shankara for waking me up from my agnostic slumber. You know, Kant said about Hume that David Hume woke him up from his dogmatic slumbers. So I credit Shankara with waking me up from my agnostic slumber. But Shankara didn't make me become a bhakta or a theist. I didn't believe in God. That was the beauty of it. I didn't have to, right? With Shankara, you can believe that you're non-dual pure consciousness. And I really felt that Shankara's philosophy is the be-all and the end-all. It's intellectually extremely logical, rigorous, and you don't need to bring in any of this pesky faith-based dogmatic beliefs in God. That kind of thing. So I'm talking about 2 phases, right? I started as agnostic, and then I moved to accept Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. And I was already planning on moving to India and becoming a monk of the Ramakrishna Order. Then what happens? I moved to India after my PhD, and I joined the order at Vivekananda University, what's now known as RKM Very in Biluma. And I'm looking after the philosophy department. And I continued to study and try to practice Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, but at the same time, there are three difficulties I was encountering as a new monk, as a new monastic of the Ramakrishna Order. So number one, I'm Bengali and I can read Bengali, and so I'm reading Sri Ramakrishna's teachings in the original Bangla, Kathamrita, Mohendranath Gupta's Kathamrita. And I was finding on every page, almost, that what Sri Ramakrishna is saying is not exactly what Shankara is saying, that I'm not able to match the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna with the teachings of Shankaracharya. What do I mean by the teachings of Shankaracharya? I mean what I found in his commentaries on the Prasthanatraya, on the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and especially the Brahma Sutra, which I think has the clearest exposition of his Advaitic standpoint. Okay, so that's the first difficulty I was encountering. I'm a Shankarite, I love Shankara, and yet I'm a monk of the Ramakrishna Order. I also like Sri Ramakrishna. And ideally, you would find that Sri Ramakrishna's teachings align with Shankara's, but again and again, I'm finding they don't exactly. I mean, of course, there are similarities. There are many points of overlap, but they're not the same. Sri Ramakrishna consistently seemed to me to be teaching a broader doctrine than Shankara. Okay, second difficulty I was encountering. I'm also studying in the original Sanskrit, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Brahma Sutra, along with Shankara's commentary and other commentaries. And I'm finding again and again that what Swami Vivekananda said about traditional acharyas, what did Swami Vivekananda say? I'll just remind you, many of you are familiar with this. Swamiji would sometimes use very strong language. And in several places in the complete work, Swami Vivekananda says that when we study the Prasthanatraya, the Vedantic scriptures, we should not blindly follow any of the traditional commentators, Shankara, Ramanuja, and so on. Not because we have nothing to learn from them, but we shouldn't blindly rely on them, blindly follow them, which means we shouldn't accept any of them as the gospel truth. Why? He said because their primary aim was to show that the scriptures support their philosophy alone. In order to do that, Swamiji said, they sometimes had to resort to text torturing. That's the strong language that I mentioned, the text torturing. And in inspired talks, he says that Shankara and the other traditional acharyas were at times conscious liars. He used another phrase that's very strong, conscious liars. They knowingly distorted what the scriptures are saying in order to make the scriptures conform to their respective philosophical frameworks. And now, in my personal study of the Prasthanatraya, I was finding that to be the case, not just with Shankara. When Shankara is confronted with passages about karma yoga or bhakti yoga, he ends up text torturing often. When Ramanuja is faced with passages in the Upanishads, for instance, which seem to talk about Nirguna Brahman, the impersonal absolute, he resorts to text torturing and so on. So I found a lot of that. And I was academically trained as a philosopher and as a student of English literature. And so I learned techniques in hermeneutics. You know, what are the best ways to study a text? The worst way, so just imagine in a graduate seminar on, let's say, Shakespeare, if on the first day the professor announces, okay, here's the book on Shakespeare, it's whatever, let's pick a scholar, Frank Kermode, and we're going to rely on his commentaries on all of Shakespeare's plays throughout the course, and you're not allowed to question it. It's 100% true, and we have to just accept that from the beginning. This would be absurd. I mean, nobody would accept that as a rigorous graduate study. And yet, nobody has problems with studying the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Brahma Sutra using Shankara's commentaries and without questioning it. And if anybody dares to question it, then they get criticized. There are all sorts of name-calling starts and emotional reactions. So it's a very strange situation. And in our order, there's a strong emphasis on Shankara's Advaita for a combination of reasons. If you want, we can talk about that during the conversation. But I found that as soon as I joined the order, I found that there's a very strong emphasis on Shankara. At the time, I was a Shankarite and I loved it. I was very happy about it. But at the same time, I'm mentioning these difficulties I was encountering as a young brahmachari. Number one, when I'm reading the Kathamrita, I'm finding that Sri Ramakrishna's teachings don't always align with Shankara's. Number two, when I'm studying the Vedantic scriptures, I'm finding that Shankara, and not just Shankara, but all the traditional acharyas sometimes resorted to text torturing. And they're not giving me a fully accurate picture of the scriptures. And I started to see the truth more and more of what Swami Vivekananda said, which is that we need to try to reinterpret the Vedantic scriptures in the light of the life and teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. So I started to do that. And then number 3, as a spiritual aspirant, as a young monk, young brahmachari, I was finding that it's the easiest thing in the world to talk about Shankara's Advaita Vedanta and to logically understand it. And it's the hardest thing in the world to practice it. And I'm not the first to realize this. Sri Ramakrishna said it again and again in the Kathamrita. If you read it carefully and in an unbiased way, he warns about this on every page almost. And since most of you are Bengali, I'll say what he says in the original. He says, if you try to practice Advaita Vedanta while still having body consciousness, Nijeke tokai or onnodeke tokai. You deceive yourself and you deceive others. And this whole phenomenon now, which has become a craze, it's called Neo-Advaita. These are so-called followers of Ramana Maharshi. They're great Advaitic saints like Ramana Maharshi, Nisargadatta Maharaj, and so on. But these Neo-Advaitans, what they're doing is they claim to be followers of these great Advaitic souls, but they kind of put down spiritual practice. They say spiritual practice is part of Maya. It's not necessary. This is the direct path. We don't need to engage in these, rigorous ethical and spiritual disciplines in order to realize that we're Brahman. We're already Brahman. Thinking that we're not already Brahman is part of the problem, and so on and so forth. So they kind of go on these. So anyway, so as a spiritual aspirant, I found that when it really mattered, when I was encountering difficulties in life, in my spiritual practice, Advaita flew out the window. And I was left with the same ordinary personality and the same emotional reactions, that it was just skim deep. It was just a kind of intellectual understanding that didn't actually reach into the deeper being. So these were the 3 difficulties I was facing as a young brahmachari, which led me, after a couple of years, especially in training center. We all have to go through a training center of 2 years. And in training center, the curriculum is also based on Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. All the commentaries we read on the scriptures are Shankara's. But because I was a philosopher, I was studying his commentaries critically, and at the same time studying the scriptures and Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. And the idea for the book came more or less in training center. And even the name Vijnana Vedanta, calling Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy Vijnana Vedanta, I believe it came to me either in training center or before that. Because if you read the Kathamrita, you'll find that on almost every page, Sri Ramakrishna uses the term Vijnana, and it's very distinctive. This is not Vigyan in the ordinary Bengali sense or in the sense of Hindi, which just means science. No, not at all. In fact, Sri Ramakrishna used a few words in English. He knew a few words in English, and one of them was science. He would say science. So this is not science. Vijnana means something very special. And I found that through a careful study of the Kathamrita, that he is presenting a new, very broad, universal, expansive, non-sectarian spiritual philosophy on the basis of his Vijnana realization. And that's the seed from which this book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, emerged. It was published by Oxford in 2018. And shortly thereafter, there was a book symposium published on it in the International Journal of Hindu Studies. 13 scholars from around the world wrote responses to the book, and then I wrote a final response as well. And I found the whole experience very fruitful. By the grace of Sri Ramakrishna, the book has been well received in academic circles. And it's provoking a lot of thought and discussion, which I think is a great thing. I don't want people to just agree with what I'm saying, but I think it's a very good sign that this book is prompting a lot of people inside our tradition, outside our tradition, monks, devotees, and so on, scholars. It's making people think more deeply about Sri Ramakrishna's ideas, his teachings, his life. One thing that's striking about Sri Ramakrishna is that even though he's worshipped by many as an avatara, as an incarnation, even those who worship him and do puja and all those things, they don't tend to take him seriously as a thinker or as a philosopher. And I think it's a serious mistake. Okay. In fact, the epigraph to my introduction is from the Lila Prasanga. It's a quotation from Swami Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda said, "Jekono ekta upodesh niye, Thakur upodesh niye, jhuri jhuri darshan grantha lekha jay." One can write shelves of philosophical books on the basis of any one of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. On the basis of any one of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, you can write shelves of philosophical. Where are those books? Where are those shelves of books? My study, as far as I'm aware, is the first serious academic philosophical study of Sri Ramakrishna. And it came 150 years after he left his body. What's going on? So I hope that my book inspires other people to follow suit and to think more deeply about him as a philosopher. I'm going to now, before I open up the discussion, I want to just mention, I'll basically give a little bit of a summary of the very first chapter. It's an 8-chapter book, and I don't want to spend the whole time just summarizing the different chapters. You can look at the book yourself, watch talks on the book. But let me summarize briefly the main argument, the core argument at the foundation of the book, which is chapter 1. That's where I articulate his philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta. Now, what I found from my research is that there are 3 main ways that people have interpreted Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. The first way is what I would call the sectarian approach. These are people who read Sri Ramakrishna's teachings through a lens, a particular sectarian lens. So for instance, there are some who say that Sri Ramakrishna basically was a follower of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. Okay. And what do? They try to show that all of his teachings align with Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, obviously. But interestingly, and this is because you guys are Bengali, you might have read the Kathamrita in Bangla, or many of you are Bengali. You'll know this. If you read the Kathamrita carefully, what you'll find is there's a chapter called Shiva Kuridaya in the heart of a sevaka, meaning these are M-zone reflections. M himself, the author of the Kathamrita, he denies that Sri Ramakrishna was a follower of Shankara. He says Sri Ramakrishna was not a Mayavadi. He didn't dismiss this world as a dream. He was not a follower of Shankara. And then M suggests that he was a follower of Ramanuja. He was a Vishishtadvaitan because he used the example of a bale fruit. Yeah. The bale analogy, that you can't, if you try to weigh a bale fruit minus the seeds in the shell, the weight of the bale fruit will fall short. And Sri Ramakrishna will say, likewise, you cannot exclude Jiva, Jagat, Ishvara from the ultimate reality and have the full weight of this world, which means Shob Jodiye Ekti. This is a beautiful phrase, which in one small sentence encapsulates what I call his integral Advaita. He was a non-dualist, but an integral Advaitan. He taught an all-embracing oneness, Shob Jodiye Ekti. Okay, it's a oneness that doesn't exclude anything. It's a oneness that embraces both Brahman and Shakti and this entire universe of names and forms. Okay, so now, so M interpreted Sri Ramakrishna as a follower of Ramanuja. There are others who interpret him as a follower of Shankara's Advaita. There are others, and some modern scholars like Walter Neville, who takes him to be a tantric, a follower of Tantra. Others who think that he's more of a Vaishnava, like Narasingha Sil, and so on. So these are all sectarian approaches. The second approach is he was not educated in a formal way, and he was a great mystic, no doubt, and a great bhakta, an ecstatic bhakta. But we shouldn't expect somebody like Sri Ramakrishna to teach a coherent and consistent philosophical system or framework. This is the second approach, which is like we're barking up the wrong tree by trying to discern a coherent philosophical framework on the basis of the Kathamrita. Narasingha Sil sometimes suggests this as well, and Amyo Shen to some extent. The third approach is what I call the non-sectarian approach to Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. And this is the one that I endorse, which is, look, any attempt to try to fit Sri Ramakrishna's teachings into any sectarian framework is bound to be limiting and Procrustean. You're going to do violence to what he's teaching because fundamentally what he's teaching is non-sectarian, which means hermeneutically, there's a fundamental flaw in trying to force him into any kind of sectarian box. Okay. So now, one thing I do in one of the early sections of chapter 1 of my book is to articulate 5 interpretive principles for studying the Kathamrita and trying to understand his teachings. I'm not going to go into all 5 of them now, but I want to focus on just 2 right now. The first one is, let's resist the impulse to read other conceptual frameworks and doctrines into Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. When we study Sri Ramakrishna's teachings in the Kathamrita, let's try to let Sri Ramakrishna speak for himself as much as possible. This is the first principle, which means what? Because, and the thing is, you might think it's obvious. It might be, but the problem is that in practice, people violate it all the time, especially from the standpoint of Shankara. What I find when people study the gospel is that in general, they'll start bringing in ropes and snakes to explain Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. Where are ropes and snakes? Show me one place in 1200 pages of Kathamrita where Sri Ramakrishna brings up the rope snake analogy. So why are we bringing it in? Other times, people will bring in this Vyavaharika and Paramatik. Vyavaharik dik theke Thakur eta bolchen. Paramatik dik. Where does he bring in this Vyavaharika Paramatik distinction in the Kathamrita? Does he say it even once? The answer is no. But people routinely read Shankara's doctrines and concepts into Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. And see, if you find good textual justification for it in the Kathamrita, that's a different thing. But I don't find that. So the first principle is, let Sri Ramakrishna speak for himself and don't impose your own ideas or other conceptual frameworks onto his teachings. And then another very, very important principle, interpretive principle that I emphasize is what I call the context principle. Sri Ramakrishna was so broad that he would often talk about many different philosophical traditions. Okay. And so he'll sometimes say things like Jnanis or Vedanta Vadis, those who follow Shankara's philosophy. They say that Shakti is not real, that this world is like a dream. Now, I remember, this is just a personal anecdote, but a few years ago, I would visit regularly a very elderly Swami named Kalipada Maharaj in Arogya Bhavan in Belumat. He's a wonderful Swami and very learned, deeply knowledgeable about Shankara's commentaries. He'd memorize whole paragraphs from Shankara's commentaries. And so we would playfully debate about Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. And he would say, no, Sri Ramakrishna was a follower of Shankara, and your Vijnana Vedanta is wrong, and so on. And he gave his evidence one day. He said, see, Sri Ramakrishna says that Shakti is Shukti Obostu, a Jagat Shopnobot. He quotes, he says, I'll show you in the Kathamrita. I said, Maharaj, I know that passage. Look at the context. And the context says, basically, followers of Advaita Vedanta say that Shakti is avastu, not real, that this world is like a dream. Ami kintu, and then he says, Ami kintu, Sri Ramakrishna. I, however, accept Shakti. I accept everything. I accept all 3 states. Ami shab avastha loy. I don't dismiss the waking dream and deep sleep states as unreal. I accept everything. So I said, Maharaj, you can't just take it out of context. That becomes cherry picking, right? He's contrasting his own view with Shankara's view. Now this brings me to how I understand his philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta. Because again and again, what you find in the Kathamrita is that he distinguishes 2 stages of spiritual realization, which he calls Jnana and Vijnana. And he uses the analogy of a staircase and a roof. He says that when you're climbing up the staircase, you say, not this, not this, neti, neti. Brahman is not this world. Brahman is not my body. Brahman is not my mind, until you reach the roof. The roof signifies the knowledge of non-dual Brahman in Nirvikalpa Samadhi. And this is the culminating ideal of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. And you completely lose external consciousness and you merge in non-dual pure consciousness. And then Sri Ramakrishna says, if you stay in that state for 21 days, you leave the body because you'll starve. And good riddance anyway, because now you know the world is unreal and that even the body's unreal, your individuality is unreal, so who cares? Okay, but he says there's a special category of soul which he calls Ishvara Kotis. And there are some others also who are not necessarily Ishvara Kotis, but who can also go beyond this state. He says, who come out of that state of samadhi, look back on the same staircase that they had traversed, that they had climbed up, and said, wait a minute, now I see that the staircase is made of the same materials as the roof, brick, slime, and brick dust. So what Sri Ramakrishna says is, whereas the Jnani believes that the only reality is non-dual, impersonal, attributeless, pure consciousness, which is his own nature, and nothing else exists, the Vijnani realizes that the ultimate reality, the divine, is equally nirguna and saguna, impersonal and personal, with and without form. And unlike the Jnani, who dismisses this world as dhokartati, as a framework of illusion, jogat mittha, the Vijnani embraces this entire world as mojarkuti, as a mart of joy. Because the Vijnani sees that Brahma Chaturbingshi Tattva Hoichan, Brahman has become the 24 cosmic principles. The world is a real manifestation of the divine. Now, is this Advaita? Certainly it's Advaita. But Shankara does not have a monopoly on what Advaita means. He's teaching one kind of Advaita, but there's so many, there's Shakta Advaita, there's Kashmiri Shaivism, and there is this integral Advaita of Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda after him, and Sri Aurobindo. So that's why Infinite Paths has become the first book in what I'm calling my integral Advaita trilogy. So the book that came after Infinite Paths is called Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism, published 4 years later in 2022, also by Oxford. In that book, I'm arguing that even though when you read the complete works, and I made the same mistake when I first read the complete works, it's easy to read Swami Vivekananda as a follower of Shankara, okay, as teaching basically classical Advaita Vedanta. What I say is, if you read carefully between the lines, what you're going to find is the way he teaches Advaita is more in line with Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta than with Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. Okay, even though he's using Shankarite concepts, even though he's talking about Advaita a lot, the kind of Advaita he's teaching, remember, there are different kinds of Advaita. He's teaching more Sri Ramakrishna's integral Advaita. He says things, for instance, in a lecture called God and Everything, Swami Vivekananda will say, Vedanta does not in reality denounce the world. It teaches the deification of the world. Just see how Vijnana-oriented that is. That's integral Advaita. It's still Advaita. It's non-dual. Why? Because there's nothing but God. But the names and forms are real manifestations of Brahman, of God. Okay, and I'm currently writing a book, the third book in this integral Advaita trilogy. It's called An All-Embracing Oneness, Sri Aurobindo's Integral Advaita and the Legacy of Sri Ramakrishna. And I'm trying to show that Sri Aurobindo is also further developing the ideas taught by Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, and he was directly influenced by both of them. I just had a very interesting 4-part debate with Peter Heehs, a very well-known intellectual historian and a friend and colleague of mine who lives in the Aurobindo Ashrama. He worked extensively on the complete works of Sri Aurobindo. He's an excellent historian. So we had a debate in International Journal of Hindu Studies. It's a 4-part debate. You can find it online. And he's arguing against my claim that Sri Aurobindo was significantly influenced by Sri Ramakrishna. He agrees that there was some influence, but he kind of downplays the influence. And I specifically argue that Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on Vijnana were especially influential on Aurobindo. And so we had a very helpful and interesting debate about this, where I defend my position, which is that Sri Ramakrishna had a very strong influence on Sri Aurobindo, especially his teachings on Vijnana. And then he's taking a different position on that. And so I encourage you to look up that debate online. It's a 4-part debate. And that debate has really helped me to sharpen my arguments in the first few chapters of my book on Aurobindo, which I'm working on now. So anyway, what I argue as a whole, these 3 books, the 3 books in my Integral Advaita trilogy, are arguing that Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, and Sri Aurobindo developed a new non-sectarian school of non-duality within the tradition of Vedanta. The moment that I say new, I find especially in India, I mean, I lived in India for 13 years and it's quite striking to me. The moment you say new, they're going to say ahankar, ego. How dare he say that? And anytime you claim anybody is original or saying something new, this is still that same old slave mentality that Swami Vivekananda was talking about long back during British colonial rule. It still pervades Indian thinking. No, you shouldn't say anything new. I really believe that now, why, if God really incarnated again in human form, do we really think that the best he could do is to pour the same old wine into a new bottle? Or why are we so reluctant to allow even God himself, when he comes in the form of a human being, not to say anything new or original? I find it astonishing, but very characteristic of the slave mentality that I found pervading India. So anyway, I think that they are developing a really new non-sectarian school of non-dualism. And the moment I say school, you might think it's sectarian. No, there's a paradox here. Swami Vivekananda called his tradition a non-sectarian sect. A non-sectarian sect. That is Vijnana Vedanta. It's a non-sectarian sect. It's a non-sectarian philosophy. This is not, I'm not trying to start a new sectarian sampradaya in the name of Ramakrishna. It's a non-sectarian sampradaya in the name of Ramakrishna. And the reason why it's so important to understand it is because unless we understand it, we won't be able to really have that broadness that Sri Ramakrishna exemplified in his own life and that he encouraged us all to adopt. Okay. I'll give you an example and then I'll close and open it to discussion. There's a lot of discussion in academic theology and philosophy of religion about religious pluralism. Okay. Alan Race is an American theologian who presented a threefold typology that has become quite helpful and popular. And I think it's useful to understand Sri Ramakrishna's teachings and how they relate to other teachings. He distinguishes three different ways that we can think about our religious faith in relation to other faiths: religious exclusivism, religious inclusivism, and religious pluralism. And there are different definitions. I'm just going to stipulate these definitions for the purposes of this discussion. Religious exclusivism is the view that my religion alone leads to the highest goal and other religions fail. They don't. They're wrong. They're hopeless. They either lead to hell or they fail to lead to the highest goal. And the second position is religious inclusivism. This is the view that my religion is the best or the highest, or the quickest way to get to the highest goal. Other religions aren't completely hopeless, but they're in some way inferior to mine. So there's a hierarchy of higher and lower. But it's more generous than the exclusivist standpoint because you're willing to grant some truth. For instance, the official Catholic position now, since Nostra Aetate, that was published in the 1960s by the Pope then, is Catholic inclusivism. This is the view that Catholicism is the best and the highest religion. Other religions may contain a ray of that same truth, which is embodied as the sun of Catholicism, right? So there's clearly even the metaphor of the sun, a little bit of a sun's ray versus the whole sun is hierarchical, higher and lower. On the Indian side, one of the best examples of religious inclusivism would be modern Advaita Vedanta. Why do I say modern? Shankara didn't talk about non-Hindu traditions, really. I mean, he talked about Buddhism, but he didn't include them as effective paths, right? He thought that they were wrong. So that was more exclusivist. But modern Advaitins, like Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan is a good example, TMP Mahadevan, what they do is they take Shankara's metaphysical framework, but apply it to the world religions. And they'll say things like, yes, we accept all the religions of the world, and so on and so forth. They'll say all these things. But at the end of the day, if you look carefully at what they're saying, they're teaching an inclusivism, an Advaitic inclusivism. Why? Because what they say is that the common goal of all the world religions is the realization of non-dual pure consciousness. Which means what? According to these modern Advaitins, a Christian practicing Christianity will only take them so far. It might bring them to a certain heaven, a Christian heaven, even have God realization, but that's not the highest goal. That won't give you the full mukti because they don't believe in any eternal heaven in that way, modern Advaitins. They'll say, yeah, you could stay there for some time, but ultimately you have to merge your identity in non-dual Brahman. That's inclusivism. By contrast, Sri Ramakrishna taught a robust religious pluralism on the basis of his Vijnana realization, on the basis of his ontology of Vijnana Vedanta. He taught that the ultimate reality is both Brahman and Shakti. Brahman in its nishkriya aspect, in its inactive, static aspect, non-dual, impersonal Brahman, and Shakti in its dynamic aspect. Okay. On that basis, he's able to place theistic and non-theistic spiritual philosophies on an equal footing, on an equal salvific footing. Why? Because the theistic traditions are grounded in the Shakti aspect of the ultimate reality. The non-theistic spiritual traditions are based on the Brahman aspect of the same ultimate reality. And because Brahman and Shakti are non-different, like fire and its power to burn, as Sri Ramakrishna used to say, Brahma Shakti Abhed, Jemon Agni ar tar Dahika Shakti. Because of that, he doesn't have to go into this hierarchical talk of higher and lower and placing Nirguna Brahman above Saguna Brahman, putting Brahman above Shakti, none of that. He places them on an equal footing. And his conception of liberation, of mukti, is also much broader than Advaita Vedanta's. Because he says he's not forcing every spiritual practitioner of any tradition to realize Nirguna Brahman. He'll say, Bhaktora chini khete chai, ora chini hote chai na. Bhaktas want to eat sugar. They don't want to become sugar. So why should we force people who don't want to eat, who don't want to become sugar to become sugar? Let them eat sugar. And this is a magical kind of sugar that doesn't give you cavities. You can eat the sugar for an eternity and you're perfectly fine. That's called dwelling in an eternal loka. You can call it Vaikuntha Loka, or Goloka, Ramakrishna Loka. That's the highest goal. Why is that liberation? Because you're liberated from all suffering. You're liberated from rebirth. You don't have to come back here again in this world of suffering. Anityam asukham lokam. Right? And you're in the best possible place with your beloved Ishta Devata. That's the goal for bhaktas. And Sri Ramakrishna will place that on an equal footing with the Advaitic ideal of merging one's individuality in non-dual Brahman, which he would call becoming sugar. He would say, like a nunet putul, a salt doll goes to measure the depth of the ocean. But the moment it sets foot in the ocean, it melts. Gole jai. Not that that's a higher ideal than the devotional one. Both are on an equal footing. So you see how that's a more robustly religious pluralist standpoint. Religious pluralism, the third of the three approaches to other faiths, is my religion is great for me, but other religions are equally great for other people. And not just that. So placing all the world religions on an equal salvific footing, they're equally effective in taking us to the highest goal. At the same time, a true religious pluralist, like Sri Ramakrishna, will say, there's always something that we can learn from spiritual traditions other than our own. So he would say, Golmal ache, golda bad diye malda na. He says, there's always, everything is a mixture of good and bad, positive and negative. So every spiritual tradition, including his own, including Hinduism, has both good and bad things. Try to separate the two things. Take what's good. Let's learn what's best in each religious tradition and try to incorporate that into our own spiritual lives. That's what I call religious cosmopolitanism. I developed that in more detail in my book on Swami Vivekananda. So with that, I'll open it up for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Swamiji. It's been very enlightening. So I have a just anecdote in my mind. So when Mayavati Ashram was established, a group of monks led by Swami Virajanandaji, I guess, went there and installed a picture of Sri Ramakrishna and started worshipping him.
Yeah.
So a letter came from Holy Mother where she wrote, as far as I remember, Tumi Advaita, Tomar Guru Advaita.
তুমি অদ্বৈত নয়, ঠাকুর অদ্বৈত।
ঠাকুর অদ্বৈত,
তোমরা অদ্বৈতবাদী, অদ্বৈতী নতবা অদ্বৈতবাদী, like that, something like that.
Yeah, but he mentioned that Thakur Advaita.
Yeah,
right?
Correct.
So how do you respond to this? Like,
yes, okay. So let me first, because I'm a scholar and because I've given hundreds of talks on YouTube, I'll first point you guys to talks that I've given on this very question. Please look at a talk I gave in Hollywood a year or two ago called Sri Ramakrishna is Advaita.
Yeah.
The whole talk is an answer to your question. So I'm going to give a very brief answer, but for details, please look at that. And I also give a talk in Sarvapayanji Center in New York called Holy Mother Sarada Devi as a philosopher.
Yeah.
And I also talk about that there. And I mentioned Bhuteshanandaji's response to that question, which is very important. So anyway, what's the short answer? The short answer is this. Notice that what Holy Mother says is Thakur is Advaita. Okay. Now, she could have said Thakur was a follower of Shankara, Shankarpanthi, but she didn't say that. She could have said Thakur Shankar Advaita. That's also possible. That he was a Shankara Advaitan, but she didn't say that. She said Thakur is Advaita, which is very interesting. And, even grammatically very interesting.
Yeah.
Thakur is Advaita. Now, what does she mean by that? I think it's open. Now, one can immediately assume that she means Shankara's Advaita, but why? Give me the justification for it. I don't think that there's any good justification for it. She wasn't a scholar of Shankara, so that when she was, of course, Holy Mother herself and Divine Mother, and she realized the Advaitic truth. That's not the same thing as, why should we assume that when she says Advaita, it means Shankara's Advaita? I just said that there are so many different kinds of Advaitic tradition, right?
That's true.
Now, that's the first thing to keep in mind. Secondly, Sri Ramakrishna is Advaita. Now, the way I take this is on the basis of, I think the best clue is, look at Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on ultimate reality. And what do we find? We find that Sri Ramakrishna's teaching, he is teaching Advaita. As I said, Vijnana Vedanta is Advaita, right? The one divine reality, the one infinite divine reality is equally Brahman and Shakti. Okay? This is just Sri Ramakrishna's, this is Thakur 101, this is Kathamrita. I don't think it's controversial that I'm saying this. He says it on every page, Brahma Shakti Abhed. When Holy Mother says Thakur is Advaita, and you are Advaita Vadis, you are followers of this Advaita of Thakur's, I take her to be saying that Thakur is equally Brahman and Shakti. Equally Nirguna Brahman and equally personal Shakti. Now, if we take Advaita to mean that, Neelam, I think, it froze for a second there. If we take Advaita to mean that, then the rest of her response makes sense. Because what does she say? She says, look, there's one ashrama in the entire world in the Ramakrishna order where we don't encourage ritualistic worship, where we don't encourage devotional practices, where the expectation is one will only engage in jnana yoga, right? The meditative practices and the practice of knowledge based on Shankara's philosophy. And she says that should continue. Now, the way I see that is she's saying, because Sri Ramakrishna is equally Brahman and Shakti, there is no problem. You're still meditating on Sri Ramakrishna when you're meditating on Nirguna Brahman, when you're meditating on non-dual pure consciousness. You remove Thakur's picture. Is it so easy to remove Thakur himself? Take away his picture. No more form. And yet Thakur remains in his Nirguna aspect as Brahman. And in every other ashrama in the entire world, this is also what Bhuteshanti emphasizes, we do a daily puja, ritualistic puja, Dashopachara puja of Sri Ramakrishna, and we have all the devotional practices, the whole gamut of mantra japa and prayer and prarthana and bhajans and all these things. And that's equally Sri Ramakrishna. Why? Because he was also Shakti. And because he was an incarnation. And so if she had said, no, Swamiji was right, therefore we're going to turn all of the ashramas into Advaita ashramas, and we're going to ban the worship of Thakur even in Belumat, that's a different thing, but that's not what you said. Out of the hundreds of centers we have in the entire world, at the time it was just restricted to India, but still, even in India there were already close to 100 centers. One out of the 100 is purely Advaitic in Shankara's sense. And she's saying, let that continue. Because Thakur is not such a small thing that when you remove his picture, that Thakur goes away. That's how I see it, because he's equally Brahman. So that's a good question. Thank you.
So I also have another question. So you wrote extensively on Bhava Mukha when I read the book. So do you think that the Bhava Mukha is the basic or the foundational principle of Thakur Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta?
Yeah, very good. So here's the thing. One thing that if you're a careful student of the main texts in our tradition, you'll know that apart from the Kathamrita, which is, I think, the most authoritative and comprehensive collection of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, there's another book, Sharadanandaji's biography of Sri Ramakrishna, Sri Ramakrishna Lila Prasanga. Now, one thing that I find very striking about these two books, when you look at them side by side, both written originally in Bangla. If you look at the Kathamrita by itself, you're going to find Vijnana on every page, almost. And almost no mention of Bhava Mukha. Actually, there's no mention of Bhava Mukha. You'll find one mention of Bhava in the sense of Bhava Mukha when he's talking about that period in his life. That's, as far as I can tell, there's only one reference, possibly two, in the entire Kathamrita. And if you turn to Sharadanandaji's Lila Prasanga, strikingly what you'll find is there's not a single mention of Vijnana in Thakur's sense, but it's full of Bhava Mukha.
Okay, yeah.
There's a whole chapter on Bhava Mukha.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is quite striking. Now, it seems to me that if you look carefully at how Sharadananji explains Bhava Mukha in the context of Sri Ramakrishna's practices and his realizations, and the way that Sri Ramakrishna himself explains Vijnana in the Kathamrita, I don't think there's any substantial difference. I'm not the first to say this. Swami Tapasanandaji says the same thing. He has an essay on Bhava Mukha where he says that basically. He uses both terms, Vijnana and Bhava Mukha, and sees them more or less as synonyms. I would say the same thing. Let me give you evidence for that. See, Bhava Mukha, the way that it's explained by Sharat Maharaj, by Sharadananji and Leela Prasanga, typically is he's in the state of Nirvikapa Samadhi, and then Divine Mother says, Tumi Bhav Mukha Thakur. Remain in Bhava Mukha. And then he comes down from Samadhi. Okay. But now his vision of the world is enriched by his knowledge of non-dual Brahman. That's always in the background, this Nirguna Brahman experience of Nirvikapa Samadhi. Now, when you look to the Kathamrita, look at the way he explains the Vijnani. He says it in the same way. He uses the example of a boat race. He says, he distinguishes the 7 planes of consciousness, Beda Shapta Bhumi. So he says, this is the 6th plane between the eyebrows. And he says, you have the vision of the personal God. And then there's the Sahasrara / 7th plane, Shaptam Bhumi. And that's Nirvikalpa Samadhi. And he says the Vijnani runs a boat race, as it were, back and forth between the 7th and 6th planes. How is that different from Bhava Mukha? It's the same thing.
Yeah. So before I move on to, I also have another question before I move on to my next question. So somebody is raising his hand. So could you please tell your name and ask Swamiji your question?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Swamiji, for this very insightful lecture. Thank you so much. And initially, when I saw this invitation, I saw 2 names, Ayon Maharaj and Swami Medhananda. I was confused, the same person. Then I went to Google and found out that you are the same person. So that's what it is. Yeah. Dashamastu, almost saying the same similar story. So my thing is very. I will read that you said about that people 13 scholars wrote about your book, the Journal of Hindu Studies. I not read that. I will go through that. Also your book. I read some chapters of your books here and there. I not read the whole book. So my question is based on today's lecture. First thing, you said about how to read a text hermeneutically, how to approach a text. Now, if I'm saying that the Vijnana Vedanta or Advaita of Ramakrishna Paramahamsa is a non-sectarian sect in a sense, and one has to read Kathamrita and other writings of Ramakrishna ji in a properly hermeneutic sense without imposing on them any other conceptual structures, if you understand your statement. Now, if I look in the Abrahamic tradition, also Indian tradition, let us take the Prasthanatri. We have the Bhashya by Shankaracharya, which gave rise to what they call Kevala Advaita. I see system as that. We have same, a text is used by Sri Ramanuja. It gives rise to Visishta Advaita. Sri Aurobindo also we have got. So my problem is this. How does one, when you say read the text hermeneutically without imposing any pre-given conceptual structure, isn't it a mirage or is it a possibility?
Right. Okay. Yeah, no, that's very good. I think that's a very good. I understand exactly what you're saying. Look, I studied these things for years as a graduate student because I was studying American poetry. And there's a reason why I gave the example of a graduate seminar on Shakespeare, right? So look, so notice what I said was we should try not to impose our own conceptual frameworks onto the text. Not that we'll succeed 100%, but we should try. We should make an effort. Okay. So yeah, it's imperfect, but it's not an all or nothing thing. Either 100% we're perfectly free from all conceptual frameworks, or 0% let's just willy-nilly impose whatever framework we feel like. There's a middle ground. And if you sit in on any graduate seminar at any top university which focuses on a particular literary text, philosophical text, whether that's Kant, whether it's Hegel, whether it's Shakespeare or Plato, okay? I think, I mean, I've been a teacher for a long time. Instead of taking one text and considering that to be the authoritative commentary, let's read multiple commentaries. Let's read multiple interpretations of the same source text, of the same Hamlet. Let's say Shakespeare's Hamlet. I'm gonna present and assign to the students 10 or 15 different interpretations of the same play. And then the whole point of the semester-long course is, let's hash this out. Let's talk about which of these interpretations do you find most plausible and why. Now, the thing is, what's the ultimate aim of that kind of conversation and discussion? Because we have brains of our own. The aim is to try to understand what the original text is actually saying. I'll give you another example that's closer to our tradition. Shuddhanandaji was a monastic disciple of Swami Vivekananda. Okay, and Shuddhanandaji was a very scholarly monk. He studied Shankara's commentaries very carefully in the original Sanskrit. Swamiji knew that. So one day, Shuddhanandaji walked up to Swami Vivekananda with a book in his hand. And Swamiji said, "What book are you reading?" He said, "Oh, I'm reading Shankara's Brahma Sutra Bhashya." Swamiji scolded him. This is recorded in Shamiji Podaprante, the reminiscences of Swami Vivekananda. He says, "Who told you to read Shankara's commentary in the Brahma Sutra? You should try to understand the intention, the Abhipraya of Vyasa." He calls him Vyasa. It's the author of the Brahma Sutra. Try to understand the original intention of the Sutrakara, the one who composed the Brahma Sutra. And then he gives an example. It's very interesting. He gives the example of 1.1.19. I wrote an entire academic article just on this, on Swamiji's approach to 1.1.19. Asmin nasya cha tad yogam shasti. Asmin nasya cha tad yogam shasti. Swamiji, so what it means, the sutra itself just means the scriptures, the Upanishads teach the yogam, the union, the connection between of Jiva and Brahman. Okay. What Swamiji says is, look, if you read Shankara's commentary on 1.1.19, you're going to find that it supports Kevala Advaita, absolute identity between Jiva and Brahman. But the sutra itself uses the word yogam for a reason, because it's broader. Yogam doesn't necessarily just mean absolute identity. Then Swami Vivekananda himself says, Ramanuja is equally justified in interpreting this yogam, the same word yogam, to mean not absolute identity, but amsha amshi bhava, master-servant bhava. Okay. This is just one example of how the overarching aim hermeneutically is, let's try to get to the original meaning of the text in question. One of the greatest helps in achieving that aim is to expose ourselves to many different interpretive approaches and perspectives. Let's read 10 commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita. And now there are websites, thankfully, that do that. They compile different commentaries, so it helps us in that endeavor. I'm teaching an ongoing class called Bhagavad Gita in the Light of Sri Ramakrishna. Now, what am I doing? The overarching aim is to interpret the Gita afresh in the light of the life and teachings of Sri Ramakrishna, which is what Swami Vivekananda wanted. But in order to do that properly, what I'm doing is using as the main textbook Sri Aurobindo's Essays on the Gita, because it's so strongly imbued with the spirit of Sri Ramakrishna. And at the same time, I'm bringing in Shankara's Bhashya. I'm looking at Ramanuja's commentaries, sometimes looking at Vaishnava commentaries, and looking at Swami Tapasanandaji's Bhagavad Gita, the scripture of mankind. Why? Won't that give people a headache? The idea is it promotes critical thinking. And we can learn from all the interpretive approaches, but we shouldn't take any one of them as authoritative. The ultimate goal is to arrive at the original meaning of the text itself. When you say, is it a mirage? You're already assuming it's all or nothing. Either it's perfect 100%. No, it's not like that. We're all imperfect. But let's make an effort.
Yeah. I have just a footnote to this question. Sorry for. I mean, you know, I am really inspired by the phrase coming from Wittgenstein, used by Kai Nielsen, Wittgensteinian fideism. The sense that, suppose you spoke about ultimate reality. I mean, those linguistically that sounds fine. I mean, all systems of tradition, religious practice are fine. But when I asked what is its content, ontological content, what is its epistemic methods, there I don't get same univocal meaning. So my point would be, in this lecture, if I'm trying to see that, in a sense, you're privileging the philosophical Advaita spiritual vision of Ramakrishna Paramahamsa as the summit in a sense, which is non-sectarian. And of course, use the word ultimate reality. Now, my point is this: when you use the word ultimate reality, Paramasatyam, whatever we call it, does that mean hermeneutically same single thing in other systems of traditional spiritual practice? I don't think it is that the case. It is that the case. So experientially, yes, I would say that. So even that famous the saying from the Vedic tradition, ekam sat vipra bahuda badanti. Ekam. Now, I was taught by Professor Ramchandra Gandhi in Delhi, who was a disciple, in a sense, philosophically, Ramana Maharshi. You know, so he would say, Atma Vichara. Who am I? That's a basic question. So my question is this: your word, your phrase, ultimate reality is the core of all religious, spiritual tradition and practice. No doubt at all. The moment I ask, what is its ontological content? What is its epistemic methodology? Practice, there is difference. That is my
No, thank you. Yeah, I think that's a very subtle question. Look, there's one thing that I want to correct maybe from the beginning is Wittgenstein is not the one who coined the term fideism. It's a much older term.
It's the Kai Nielsen brings it in fideism. I've read this work.
I know. The word is much older than Wittgenstein. It's not
fideism much older.
Right. Kai Nielsen is a kind of neo-Wittgensteinian. Yeah, that's right. So anyway, I just want to clarify that fideism, because I've written about fideism, and even William James, arguably in a certain period, the Will to Believe essay is a fideistic kind of text, and so on.
Right.
Okay, now with regard to your more substantive question, I think it's a great question. Now look, there are a few things here. I think your question combines multiple questions. So one aspect of it has to do with, you use the word privileging, okay? Privileging Ramakrishna's understanding of ultimate reality, suggesting that even though I'm claiming that he was that he was a robust religious pluralist, that there might be an inclusivist dimension as well, a kind of hierarchy where he's privileging his own conception of the absolute, of ultimate reality over others. And let me clarify that. And I talk about this in more detail in chapter 3 of my book on Swami Vivekananda, Swami Vivekananda's Vedanta Cosmopolitanism. It's very important to distinguish two different ways of thinking about how the different faith traditions relate to one another and how the different conceptions of ultimate reality relate to one another. One is along the axis of doctrinal truth, and the other is the axis of salvific efficacy. Okay? Now, what I'm claiming is that Ramakrishna is a robust religious pluralist in affirming the equal salvific efficacy of multiple spiritual paths. Whether you're a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew or a Sikh or a Hindu or an Advaitin or Buddhist or so on, you are in an equally good position as anyone else of a follower of any other tradition to reach the highest goal as conceived by your home tradition. Okay? That's, I think, Ramakrishna's position. If you want details, you have to read my book. It's chapter 3 of Infinite Paths, and then chapter 3 of the Swami Vivekananda book. Okay, so that's the position. Now, in order to affirm the equal salvific efficacy of the different world religions, to do that in a rigorous way and not fall into the trap of what I call, this is one of my favorite phrases, not fall into the trap of lazy harmonizing. Lazy harmonizing. I'm not claiming Ramakrishna was a kind of impressionistic harmonizer. Oh, everything is, all the religions are true, and why can't we all just get along? No, he was a very rigorous thinker. How do you harmonize? How do you rigorously harmonize the different world traditions, the spiritual traditions? How do you rigorously show that Christianity and Islam and Judaism and Hinduism and Advaita and Buddhism and so on and so forth are all equally capable of taking us to the highest goal? In order to do that rigorously, you have to have a coherent metaphysical framework to support that claim. A coherent metaphysical framework. That is what I'm calling Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. Now, what does Ramakrishna say? He says, look, I underwent many different kinds of spiritual disciplines. in many different spiritual traditions. Within Hinduism, I practice Tantra and Vaishnavism and Advaita Vedanta and Shaktism, and he has this whole list. And he realized God in many, many forms and aspects, and in the formless aspect, and in the Nirguna aspect. He practiced Advaita Vedanta also. And he practiced Christianity, and he practiced Islam. And he claimed to have realized the highest goal of each of these traditions. And what he saw was, wow, through the practice of all these different paths, I'm not realizing different ultimates. I'm realizing different forms and aspects of one and the same infinite divine. Okay. Let me use an analogy to make this maybe more compelling to you, or more intuitive. I'm a world traveler at this point. I've visited many countries. Okay. And I've lived in 4 countries, at least. I lived in the US for many years, and India, and Oxford, and Germany. Okay. Now, there's another person who spent his entire life in India. And if I visit that person, I say, hey, you're like a frog in a well. And let's assume that he's not constrained socioeconomically, and so he has the money to travel. I say, why don't you visit other countries? He goes, you're talking about these countries like the US and Germany, but I don't believe it. Why should I believe it? I said, get on a plane and go, and you'll experience it for yourself, that there are countries, there are 7 continents in this world of ours. Likewise, Ramakrishna is saying the same thing about these different spiritual conceptions of the ultimate reality. He says, these Christian mystics who have realized God as Christ, these Muslim mystics, the Sufis who have realized God as Allah, these Advaitins who have realized the ultimate as Nirguna Brahman, these Buddhists who have realized Shunyavada and Bodha, and all these things, they're all right. All of them have realized the highest goal according to their tradition, and yet they're all like these blind men touching different parts of the same elephant. And so notice, how can he say that? What is his epistemic standpoint from which you can say that with confidence? Because he's practiced all these different traditions. And because he's realized the ultimate from different aspects. So he's touched the elephant from the tail side. He's also touched the same elephant from the trunk side. He's also touched the same elephant from the body side. And so he has a more expansive knowledge of the same ultimate reality. The chameleon example is also one that he likes to use. He says, look, I have seen, the Vijnani is the one who has seen the chameleon as yellow, red, blue, and colorless. Whereas other realized souls, these are not just sadhakas, these are realized souls, have realized the chameleon as blue. And then they generalize and say, I've realized that the ultimate truth is just the blue chameleon. And then there are the Christians who say that, no, you're wrong. I've realized that the chameleon is only yellow. What Sri Ramakrishna says is, drop the only from your vocabulary. Don't limit the chameleon to only one color. Don't limit Bhagavanir kono iti nai, tar kono iti nai. Never place a limit to the divine. Never say God can only be this and nothing more. And because Sri Ramakrishna has experienced the same ultimate reality in many different aspects and forms, he can say that on the basis of his own experiences. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I also have another question which is related to the hermeneutic part, that that you mentioned that there are 5 interpretive principles by which the philosophy of Sri Ramakrishna can be reconstructed from Kathamrita. So which principle do you think is most important to be discussed?
Yeah, I already emphasized the 2 out of the 5 that I think are the absolute most important. Because I see that people are falling into these mistakes constantly. They're not abiding by these principles, and as a result, they'll say things like, look, I mentioned Kalipada Maharaj, cherry picking, Gyanira bole Shokti Obostu, Shopnavot. See, yeah, that's true. Thakur says that. He talks about so many different standpoints, but then he also says, but for my part, Ami Kintu, Eti Amar Pakamot. He'll distinguish his own position from. One time he says Hazra is saying all this stuff about how Shakti is a lower truth. He says Hazra ekankar mot ki ulti dicche. That means ekankar mot. See, he's referring to his own standpoint. Not that it's a loosey-goosey, anything goes, lazy harmonizing. Many people make the mistake of thinking Sri Ramakrishna was a lazy harmonizer type of kind of, he just kind of casually said that every path leads to the same goal, Jotamot, Tatapad, you can repeat it like parrots. No, it's a very rigorous harmonizing. But you can only have a rigorous harmonizing on the basis of a coherent metaphysical framework. Now, Number one, context matters. So don't cherry pick teachings from the Kathamrita. Look at the context. Look at to whom is he speaking. That's important. You'll find sometimes, many times, people will come in from different faiths. So a Vaishnava, like a Goswami, will come, and he'll be the hardcore Vaishnava with this Vaishnava. At the same time, he'll say, I love your Krishna as much as you do, but don't limit the divine to just Krishna. Also remember that Krishna has a Nirguna aspect and so on. When an Advaitan will come, Mohima Chakraborty, there are other Advaitans who would come to him. He would say, yes, Nirguna Brahman is wonderful. I also realized it when Totapuri came and I was in Nirvikapa Samadhi. But don't limit the divine to just the Brahman aspect, just the Nirguna, because Brahma Shakti Abhed. Brahman and Shakti are non-different, like fire and power to burn. So he would always correct the one-sidedness of the people who would come to him. So that context is so important for situating and contextualizing his teachings. That's the first really, really crucial hermeneutic principle. And the other one is, I find this tendency even among teachers of the gospel. I'm not naming names, but it's extraordinary. When you're explaining a passage from the gospel, willy-nilly, they're bringing in Shankara's concepts.
Yeah.
Without any justification.
So
I mean, this is done routinely and constantly. And I think this needs to be stopped. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, Maharaj. So it reminds me two monks from the order, Ramakrishna Order, especially Swami Gambhirananda ji and Premeshananda ji. They almost kind of interpreted the entire life, the philosophy of Sri Ramakrishna in the light of Advaita. So in another group, there is the scholars like Tapasyananda ji who want to excavate the original ideas of Sri Ramakrishna. So there are like two parallel conflicting groups. So I think it's possible, but it's quite hard to kind of make a bridge between two conflicting groups. And
I agree with you that it's hard, but I don't think it's impossible. And that's why I'm encouraging more rigor, bringing in more rigor and care in the discussion and study of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. That's all I'm asking. Not that one side is 100% right. And okay, and now let's look. Okay, now for instance, you mentioned Gambhirananda and Premeshananda. Now look, I would not consider them to be the most scholarly exponents of the Shankarite approach to our tradition. Do you know why? Because they didn't produce much scholarship on this issue. Gambhirananda has produced extraordinarily accurate and luminous English translations of Shankara's commentaries, Sanskrit commentaries. He's written a couple essays here and there in Bangla that are interpreting Sri Ramakrishna's and Swami Vivekananda's teachings. A little bit, not much. I actually find the most rigorous scholars, monastic scholars in our tradition that defend a more Shankarite interpretation to be different. You didn't mention them. One is Swami Dhireshananda and the other is Swami Omkarananda. Okay, and I talk about their essays, their Bangla essays in my Infinite Paths Chapter 1. Swami Dhireshanandaji wrote 2 articles in Udbodan. One is called Nana Drishtite Sri Ramakrishna and another called Swami Vivekananda or Advaitabad. I think those are very rigorous attempts to interpret Ramakrishna's teachings and Swami Vivekananda's teachings in the light of Shankara. And then Swami Omkarananda wrote articles called Brahma Shakti Abhed and Nitya Lila, also published in Udbodan. You can find them. And the interesting thing is, even among the Shankarites in our order, they adopt different strategies and see, why do I like them better from a scholarly standpoint? Because they're trying to bring rigor into the discussion. That's why I appreciate it. I disagree with both of them. Okay. Yeah. But they're bringing the level of rigor up to a higher level. And what are their strategies? Omkaranandaji's strategy is to try to force every single one of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings into the Shankara framework. So I'm not joking. In his article called Brahma Shakti Abhed, when he's talking about Sri Ramakrishna's teaching, Brahma Shakti Abhed, he says, well, what did Sri Ramakrishna mean? He brings in the rope and the snake. And he's somehow trying to bring the rope and snake into Sri Ramakrishna's teaching. Yeah. He does his best. Okay? I would argue that's text torturing because Sri Ramakrishna doesn't, when you say, the problem with the rope and the snake is an illusory appearance of the rope. Sri Ramakrishna never says that Shakti is an illusory appearance of Brahman. It's equally real. Fire and its power to burn is not at all similar to the rope snake analogy. So there are, I think, serious flaws in his methodology, but at least Omkaranandaji is trying to be rigorous in his approach. Dhireshanandaji adopts a totally different strategy for claiming that our tradition is basically grounded in Shankara. You know what it is? He brings in Adhikari Veda.
Yeah.
Very different. He just right at the outset, he says, Sri Ramakrishna taught Shankara's Advaita to only one of his disciples. Who was that? The greatest of all of them, Swami Vivekananda. Is that a coincidence? No.
Yeah.
Right? Because Advaita is the highest and most difficult philosophy to grasp and to practice, he taught it to only his greatest disciple, which proves that Shankara's Advaita is the highest philosophy. I think this is a more promising strategy for trying to claim that Sri Ramakrishna was a Shankarite. Still, I don't think it's a fully successful argument, and I argue against it. Now, those to me, to my mind, are far more rigorous than Premeshanji. What we have are dialogues or letters, and exchanges. Suitananji is recording his conversations. He does often use Shankarite vocabulary, but I would not consider him a scholar of Shankara in that sense.
Yeah,
Whereas Direshananda and Omkarananda definitely are more serious.
That I agree.
Now, and so now, but let's come back to your broader point, or your question, which is that isn't it hard to pick sides? Yeah. I'm not encouraging you to. I just want people to think for themselves more. I think Indians are still stuck in this slave mentality. I really feel that. And they're afraid to think for themselves. I talk about K.C. Bhattacharya's essay that was written. It was a lecture that he then was transcribed called Swaraj and Ideas. It's a beautiful talk. And it applies with full and equal force in 2026 in India than when he first spoke it 100 years ago or whatever. I mean, it's absolutely necessary that start to think for yourself. Think for yourself, but think in a serious and a rigorous way without name calling, without becoming ad hominem. And that's all. And look at the best and the brightest of what they've produced and then decide for yourself. That's all I'm saying. Now, is it easy? No. But at the same time, we can have a common ground. What's the common ground? Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. That's why I'm bringing in the hermeneutic principles. Now, let me ask Omkarananda, Direshan, the people who are trying to follow in their footsteps, give me your hermeneutic principles. Justify your reading.
Yeah.
You see, if you disagree with my context principle, then present alternative hermeneutic principles. Nobody's doing it. Nobody to date, it's now been almost 10 years since the book was published. Not one person inside our tradition or outside the tradition has been able to challenge the fundamental arguments of infinite paths at a commensurately academic level and at a commensurate level of rigor. There's been a lot of name calling. There's been a lot of emotional reactions and hurt feelings and dismissal, but no serious rigorous engagement with what I've done, apart from academic scholars. And as I said, there's a whole hundreds of pages long book symposium showing that academic scholars have taken what I've written very, very seriously and made some legitimate criticisms and points, and those are great. But I'm encouraging people who accept the Shankarite interpretation of our tradition, please get your act together. It's embarrassing. The lack of rigor in your engagement with what I'm doing is really pathetic. And please up your game a little bit.
So I can see two hands. Like, can you please unmute yourself and ask your question to Swamiji? Anugya, and I cannot see your name. Hi. Yeah, Anugya. We cannot hear you, Anugya.
Yeah, Anugya, you unmute yourself or something.
Yeah. Still cannot hear you. Yeah, you are audible now. Yeah.
Namaste.
Hi. So the question I want to ask is, in a way, I agree with you that there is this problem of rigor. But what I'm wondering is that, because I am also trained in the humanities in the university system, and I understand what close reading and those kind of techniques mean. What I am thinking about is that it's precisely that such a framework which comes from education, from the university, from the humanities, which have emerged in a certain context, and which is not to say that that context is not universalizable. Or rather, that the university hasn't spread in that way. It has, but I'm wondering whether rigor without institutional support and without the humanities being available in this larger way, whether rigor can be sort of expected from individuals. So I'm just wondering what would be an infrastructure, what would be a structural way of thinking rigor here, rather than like a simple way of saying it is that certain people are just not rigorous, which is fine. I mean, it's possible. But to say that, but what I'm wondering is whether there is a certain kind of training, a certain kind of intellectual environment which is missing, and which was not available even to Ramakrishna. It wasn't available to Vivekananda. They were autodidacts to some extent, which even in the best of universities, good scholars often are. At a higher level, you are still learning yourself. You're teaching yourself. So, but that sort of training in hermeneutics and all of that is what creates that rigor, which brings it here. So
yeah. Okay, I get it. I get what you're saying. Look. There are a few things here. Okay, I mean, a short way of, I think I agree with at least one major aspect of what you're saying, which is that the reason why most Indians are not able to engage my work rigorously is because of their defective education. And yeah, okay, and then we're going to have to look into sociological and socioeconomic reasons for the defective education. Going back to K through 12, it seems to me that the Indian educational system too strongly emphasizes rote memorization at the expense of critical thinking and creativity and originality. So I think that is a large part of the reason why Indians in general, look, I'm making these sweeping generalizations, but I think there's a reason why many of the best and the brightest Indians leave India to do their higher education. What's the reason? And if you ask them what they got from it, they'll tell you, oh my goodness, we learned how to think after getting out of India. And just imagine if some of the greats like Sundar Pichai and Amartya Sen stayed back in India. People would drag them down and not let them grow in various ways. So there are problems that are endemic to Indian culture. Swami Vivekananda said Ishabhab, jealousy, is the bane of India, and it remains the bane of India. There's a lot of politics and corruption. There are also very strong cultural biases. I'll just, look, I was raised in a Bengali family in the US, but still, my parents have more of a typical Bengali mindset. What is a typical Bengali mindset? If you do well on your Madhyamik, that 10th grade exam, you go into the science stream. If you do badly, you go into the humanities stream, what they call arts. What's going to be the result of that kind of thinking, that kind of cultural stigma against the humanities subjects? Usually the worst students are the ones going into humanities. Is it starting to change? I hope so. Maybe you can tell me, you're there more. But these things are slow to change. So now if the best and the brightest are going into science subjects, you cannot study the Kathamrita and the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita like you study a physics textbook or a computer science textbook. So people with top-class science educations are not equipped hermeneutically to study the Vedantic scriptures or Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. And the ones who go into humanities may not be the best and the brightest. Some of them are, but they're the exception in India. So there's so many complex sociological reasons why people are not able to bring a really high level of rigor to these kinds of discussions. But that's not an excuse. And a lot of the people I'm talking about have the privilege of a good education. Even then, they're not able to. Why? Because they have certain blinders on. There are certain strong emotional biases and prejudices which are blinding them to and preventing them from a more rigorous engagement with what I'm saying. They won't even listen. See, most of the people who are dismissing what I'm saying haven't read what I've written. So I'm just encouraging, read what I'm writing, look at the evidence, assess it for yourself, and then give counter evidence. Yeah, are there reasons why they're not rigorous? Yeah, but then, get your act together, India. It's 1947, it was independence. Now it's been 75 years. Are we going to keep blaming Macaulay? Give me a break. I'm serious. I'm quite serious. Indians need to start taking responsibility for themselves.
I don't disagree with that. All I'm saying is that these two things, the structural aspect and the fact of some sort of emotional defensiveness and all of that. These two are not independent of each other.
I'm happy to concede it. So what's the takeaway from that? I mean, I agree with you, and yet are you saying therefore we shouldn't talk about these things, or it's understandable that there's no, I think it's understandable, but I think it's also not excusable in that way. That Indians have been independent for 75 years. You need to try to remove these cultural biases against the humanities in India. The teachers have an obligation starting in kindergarten to inculcate more critical thinking, originality, and creativity in their students. And try to prevent the brain drain that's been happening for so many years. Why are the best and the brightest leaving India to go to other countries and not coming back? Let's think deeply and not make excuses. That's what I'm saying.
So we need to move on to the next question. So we can see another hand. So could you please unmute yourself and ask Swamiji?
I think it's Vic. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Swamiji. So thank you so much for giving this talk. And I loved your book. And I keep coming back to this one part in chapter 2 in the section about the paraconsistent God. So you demonstrated that Sri Ramakrishna captured what's defensible out of Gurkha's framework. God is qualitatively, but not maximally infinite. So there's at least one contradictory property pair, like evil, not evil, that God does not instantiate both sides of. And I'm curious about how we can epistemically ground this view. So let's grant all of chapter 6 as well as Vivekananda's AEV from Vedanta cosmopolitanism. So we're rationally justified in believing the testimony of qualified mystics. Here's the question. How can an Abda, and by extension us, differentiate between the God of Sri Ramakrishna and the maximally infinite God of Gurkha, given that mystical experiences of God is not evil are compatible with either framework?
Okay, this is a very sophisticated and technical question. So thank you. You've read my work carefully, and you're referring to a lot of things which probably most people won't even understand. AEV is the argument for the epistemic value of mystical experience that I develop in chapter 6 of my Infinite Paths, and then also in more detail in chapters 5 and 6 of my book on Vivekananda. In chapter 2, one section of chapter 2 of Infinite Paths, I bring Sri Ramakrishna into dialogue with a German theologian and philosopher named Benedict Paul Goeke, who's a friend and colleague of mine. And he defends the idea of a paraconsistent God, paraconsistency. I don't, to be honest, because I published the book in 2018, I don't remember all the technical details of my argument there. But I do want to flag one thing, and I'm not sure you've looked at this. But in the book symposium, Michael Allen specifically, I think Benedict himself actually wrote a response to the book Infinite Paths, but Michael Allen at University of Virginia wrote in his response something that made me rethink aspects of my argument in chapter 2 about the paraconsistent God. And it actually led me to modify my view in this regard. Michael Allen's position is, look, if you look at Ramakrishna's teachings, I don't think that you need to appeal to paraconsistency in order to make sense of how ultimate reality can be equally Brahman and Shakti, Nirguna, Saguna, Nirakara, Sakara, because we can, in a non-paraconsistent manner, simply bring in the language of aspects. So, and you know, I knew that, and but after thinking carefully about what Michael was saying, it made me rethink Ramakrishna's teachings in this regard, and to think more about how this language of aspects might help us to understand his views on ultimate reality without resorting to paraconsistency. And I'll give you an example where I think that it really supports Michael's case here. Sri Ramakrishna in Bengali will say in the gospel, he says, "Jokhon tini nishkriyo tokhon ami brahma bole koy. Jokhon tini srishti sthiti pralay korchen tokhon ami shakti bole koy, kali bole koy." When I think of ultimate reality as nishkriya, inactive, then I call it Brahman. And when I think of that same reality as creating, preserving, and destroying the world, then I call it Shakti or Kali. So he doesn't use exactly the word aspects, but that's literally what's going on here, right? It's the same ultimate seen from different aspects. That's the point of the chameleon parable. That's the point of the blind man and the elephant parable. Same reality seen from different aspects or standpoints. Swami Vivekananda, when he was giving a lecture in a Christian church in, I believe, Oakland or something like that, long back. And he used the example of the church itself. He goes, look, you can look at this church from the front entrance and it'll look a certain way to you. You can go around to the back entrance and look at it from behind and it'll look like a very different thing, and yet it's the same church. So if you bring in the language of aspects, we may not even need to bring in the concept of paraconsistency. That's kind of the latest thinking. You can look at the symposium, look at Michael's response to my book, and then also my final response where I talk about that. So yeah, that's where I stand on that. Did I cover it or no?
Yeah, that answers it pretty well. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Also, there's a question in chat. Just wanted.
Okay, Nilambar, you want to look at the question in chat? I can open it too.
You mentioned Thakur's idea of Vijnana and the nature of religious pluralism endorsed by him. Need to move out of the room to attend.
Oh, this is not a question. He's an old PhD student of mine, Jonathan. Thank you, Jonathan.
So
what about the previous one?
Anirban has a question, I guess.
Yes.
Should we read Anirban's? Let me read that. My mic is not working. Okay, when you are saying we should at least try to understand the original meaning, are you saying we should try to understand the essence and orientation of the primary book? For example, in case of Mandukya Upanishad, we should focus on the 12 mantras rather than the bhashyas, and how to use this methodology to deal with a book like the Brahma Sutra. Can you please elaborate a bit? Okay, great. So yes, I am saying that. I'm saying, for instance, we've got the Mandukya Upanishad. We also have Gaudapada's Mandukya Karika. Now, if you try to interpret the Mandukya Upanishad solely on the basis of Gaudapada's Mandukya Karika, you're going to end up with a very strongly classical Advaitic reading of Mandukya Upanishad. Obviously, because it's a classical Advaita commentary on the Mandukya Upanishad. Am I saying you shouldn't read Gaudapada? No, but I hope I already made clear from the earlier part of this conversation that I'm not saying don't read these commentaries, read multiple. The best antidote to dogmatism, fanaticism, one-sidedness is expose yourself to different standpoints. So alongside Gaudapada's Mandukya Karika, read non-Advaita commentaries on the same text. Just as if I want to understand T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, I'm not going to rely on one commentary. I'm going to read 5, 10. I read something like 50, I think, probably, when I was studying his text. And then when I was at Oxford, I had a whole class just on T.S. Eliot's poems and plays. And then my professor said, well, what's your view? And I said, what, my view? That was when I woke up. I mean, from my dogmatic slumber in a way, you know? And I said, oh, I didn't even think you cared about my view. But yeah, now give me your view, give it in a 10-page research paper, and then don't just give me what other people think. So that's exactly, and so how do we deal with it with respect to Brahma Sutra? I gave you an example. I already said about Swamiji's comment about Brahma Sutra 1.1.19 Asmin Nasya Chatad Yogam Shasti. And I'm glad you gave this, you asked this question because it's a great plug for my academic article. Please look at it. It was published in a book on Swami Vivekananda, edited by Rita Sharma, Sherma. And the essay is available through my website and also through academia.edu. And it's called Asmin Nasya Chatad Yogam Shasti, Swami Vivekananda's Samanvaya Vedanta as a basis, I can't remember, as a hermeneutic basis for reinterpreting the Brahma Sutra. It's a whole article just on answering your question, basically. How we can start to study the Brahma Sutra in a non-sectarian way. Yeah, so look at the article, look at the sources I cite. There are a number of books which are very valuable in this regard. For instance, V.S. Ghate, I think he was a Marathi scholar. He's written a book on this, and he's trying to do that. He's trying to get to the original meaning of the Brahma Sutra. George C. Adams has written a book on Brahma Sutra, which is very good. And very, very recently, a friend and colleague of mine named Alexander Uskokov, who's a professor at Yale University, he's written a book published by Bloomsbury called The Philosophy of the Brahma Sutra, which is also very good. So these are all resources that you can look at. And look at my article, as I said.
So anyone is typing, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. And in the meantime, does anyone else have a question?
Yeah. So, Swamiji, it would be great if you send me 2 articles written by Dhireshanandaji and Omkaranandaji in Bangla.
Oh, yeah, I think I have them. Yeah, that's easy. I have PDFs, so I can just send them to you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Pranam Swami, can you hear me?
Yes, tell me your name.
My name is Kedar. I had a minor question, something which Nilambar asked earlier about Bhava Mukha. And in your book, I came across the term Bhava Samadhi. So Bhava Samadhi, Bhava Mukha, and Vijnana, are they the same thing? See,
No.
on page number 174 and 175, you are discussing about Jesus Christ and Thakur. Thakur is practicing Christianity, and on the third day, he sees a vision of Jesus in the garden, and at first he sees the physical form, and he doesn't recognize him. After that, he merges inside him. So it is like Saguna Brahman he sees at first, and then he merges inside him. So it is slightly different than Vijnana. So is Bhava Samadhi and Vijnana same, or are they different?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. So you're asking about these three terms used by Sri Ramakrishna, Vijnana, Bhava Mukha, and Bhava Samadhi. And let me clarify my view. My view is that Bhava Mukha is more or less equivalent to Vijnana, but neither Bhava Mukha nor Vijnana is equivalent to Bhava Samadhi. Okay? I never say that anywhere, actually. And if you think I say that, if you think I'm equating Bhava Samadhi with either Bhava Mukha or Vijnana, please tell me.
That's my question, because it's slightly different. Because in Bhava Samadhi, he sees.
It's not slightly different. It's totally different.
Okay. He sees the physical form, and then he merges.
Look, the point is, I agree with you. So we don't need to make heavy weather of it. But let me just explain. In the Kathamrita, Sri Ramakrishna distinguishes different kinds of samadhi. And in one place, at least, he distinguishes Bhava Samadhi from, and he uses Bhava Samadhi as a synonym for Chetana Samadhi. Chetan Samadhi. Okay? And he contrasts that with Nirvikalpa Samadhi, or what he calls Jada Samadhi. So Jada Samadhi or Nirvikalpa Samadhi is like reaching the roof, and it's like the saltal merging into the ocean. You lose external consciousness and so on and so forth. He says Bhava Samadhi or Chetana Samadhi is a kind of theistic state of samadhi in which you have a direct vision of the personal God. That's why the Jesus one falls in that category. That has nothing to do with Vijnana. There's so many theistic saints who have attained Bhava Samadhi but have failed to reach Bhava Mukha / Vijnana. So the two things are not at all the same thing. And I don't think I ever say that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Probably this is a task of an avatara, as Ramakrishna says that avatara is capable enough of lightening both the external and the internal, right? It's like a lamp which can.
Yeah. So look, this is one way in which my view has been modified to a certain extent since the publication of my book. In Infinite Paths, in chapter 1, I quote Sri Ramakrishna and sometimes make it seem as if the realization of Vijnana is restricted to the category of what he calls Ishvara Kotis.
Ishvara Koti. Yeah.
And then he defines Ishvara Koti as, in a very precise way, as avatar ba avatarar angsho. Either an incarnation or one who is born as an amsha of an avatara. And I seem to think at the time that Sri Ramakrishna pretty much did restrict the realization of Vijnana to this group of Ishvara Kotis. Since then, I have revised my view to a certain extent. Looking more carefully at the Kathamrita, what I find is that there are certain places in the Kathamrita where Sri Ramakrishna leaves open the possibility that even non-Ishvara Kotis can attain the state of Vijnana. There's a place especially, let me see if I can bring it up very quickly here. 1 second. I'm going to try to find it right now so that I can give you the direct. Sri Ramakrishna on Vijnana. Okay, this is the one. Okay. Here it is. Okay. He says, this is on page 346 of the Akhanda Bangla Kathamrita, December 22nd, 1883. He says, Tai Ishwar avatirno hoy bhaktir upadesh den, sharanagato hote bolen. Bhakti theke tar kripaয় সব হয়, জ্ঞান বিজ্ঞান সব হয়. Okay. I think this is pretty strong evidence from the Kathamrita directly that Sri Ramakrishna leaves open the possibility that through bhakti, even if you're not an Ishvara Koti, by the grace of the divine, you can actually attain both jnana and vijnana. Another piece of evidence that's more kind of, you can say, devotional or something, it's less textually grounded, but Mahapurush Maharaj, Shivananda.
Yeah, Shivananda. Yeah, it's also mentioned in Shivananda.
He wrote a letter in which he said, Thakur amake Ishwar Koti chapras denni. He didn't give me the stamp of an Ishwara Koti. Kintu ta kripai, but by the grace of Sri Ramakrishna,
Yeah.
I have been elevated to the status of an Ishvara Koti. So again, these two statements, the one by Thakur in the Kathamrita and Mahapurush Maharaj's statement, kind of go hand in hand here. I think there's more wiggle room there than I had thought earlier. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. So we don't have any more question, I guess. If somebody has any question, we request them to ask directly to Swamiji, or we will close this session.
Very good. Thank you to everyone for the excellent, thoughtful questions. It's clear that many of you have actually studied my work, which is a real, I'm delighted to see that, because I'm used to having people ask me stuff about my views without having read a word of what I've written, which is a little frustrating when you spend years of your life working hard writing things that people don't read. So thank you, everybody. I really appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Swamiji. Thank you.
Thank you. So we are concluding this session. So I'll request Rick to convey your vote of thanks. Yeah.
Thank you, Swamiji. Thank you so much for this rigorous discussion on your book. Not just on your book, but to enlighten us on the Vijnana Vedanta of Sri Ramakrishna, and also we who have been residing in Kolkata and reading his books and works from I would rather say within this environment. We have seen him in such a specific way. We don't question him much. Whatever he has taught us, we took it as an aptavakya and took it as a pramana, but we hardly try to understand that his teachings are different at times for different adhikaris, for different people also. And also whatever he is saying is not just it's not just coming out of Bhava Samadhi or something, but it has some scholarly rigorous thought process into it. I guess this is what we need to read it, how we need to read it again, his Kathamrita and Lila Prasanga as well. Thank you so much for that, for enlightening us. And for others, I would like to mention that we have one more event coming up on August 16 by our own Professor Monima Chadda on Exploring Selfless Minds, a contemporary perspective on Vasubandhu's metaphysics. Please do register for that event as well. And thank you for attending today's event with this, thank you so much, everyone. And pranam, Swamiji, again.
Thank you,
Thank
Swami.
you so much. And I'm glad to hear that Monima will be joining you. I'll be seeing her in Venice in a couple of weeks. There's a big 6-day consciousness conference where I'll be meeting her for the first time. So I'm looking forward to that. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. Should I do a Shanti mantra to close it up?
For sure. Yeah. Please. Yes.
Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Paramastu.
Thank you.
Thank you. Namaste.
Thank you.